Hey everybody. So today we're gonna continue kind of that free form conversation we tried last week or last time with Ben and Josh, more of a fireside chat. So truly unscripted, more organic, which I think is our favorite style anyways.
That's what's popular right now.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I like to listen to.
Yeah. And we've even gotten, requests. Obviously, me and Josh travel and do meetings together, and we'll drive in the car, and inevitably it turns into this financial conversation because that's what we love to talk about.
Can't help it.
Can't help it, right? Yeah, exactly.
I can't talk about it with my wife.
Exactly. Yeah. Not for the 100th time, right? And so sometimes clients will say, hey, like I would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. Like, what's that like if you guys are just riffing
or right in the backseat?
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's what this is going to be. Obviously with a framework though. So we're going to have a framework around retirement income, planning for retirement in general, maybe financial independence, basically the concept of living off of your assets, right?
Right. I want to make sure that my assets live longer than I do.
Yes, exactly. Not running out of money.
Right.
I've been with Apriem now almost five-ish years.
It'll be 5 years in November.
Okay, it's coming up on 5 years. And then, but you've also been in the industry before that, almost a decade or so, right?
Yeah. So I guess I'm going on. Well, I've been in the industry for more than 15 years now. Yeah. I actually started in 2009 is when I first got into the industry. So, coming off of, or really just kind of coming out of, the 08, recession.
Yeah.
And interesting time too, because, I didn't really know anything about the financial services or the finance world at that point in time. So, I come in when things are not roaring and not doing well.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at what's happening with the interest rate environment right now. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've never seen anything like this in my entire career.
Sure.
Because of really when I got started anyway. But that's
sure. Yeah. But while you were doing that though, for those 10 years, right? So you were predominantly almost exclusively retirement planning for income purposes and personal pensions, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that's probably why I got volunteered anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So before I came to Apriem, I actually worked on the insurance side of the business, and I was a wholesaler, pretty much specifically looking at using annuities and retirement income planning. And before everybody freaks out, right? Annuities can have a negative connotation that can go along with them. And so we'll even talk a little bit about that today and kind of where some of that negative connotation comes from, and what's appropriate versus what's not appropriate. But yeah, so I got started on that side of the business, and the real difference is that a wholesaler, when I came in, my clients were advisors.
Sure.
And Chris, how long have you and I mean, I must have heard your name easily more than 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think we probably knew of each other for maybe 9-10 years now.
Yeah.
And then we started kind of working together, became more than just acquaintance or name.
Yep.
Maybe 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And then now we've been officially working like in the same firm now for about 5 years.
About 5 years.
Yeah.
And so that was in that type of business, Chris would have been one of my clients, right? I typically worked with advisors. Advisors were my clients, and that was kind of how our relationship started. And that meant that you would have clients you'd be working with, and we could get together, and I could help to develop some type of a retirement income plan or strategy as a piece of the overall financial and comprehensive financial planning that you were doing.
Yep.
And I mean, I enjoyed that for a long time. In fact, the people I was working with, one of them was my best friend since childhood, who was the best man in my wedding, and I was the best man at his wedding. And then like right next door to me was my other best friend since childhood, and I was the best man at his wedding, right? And the other guy was a groomsman at his wedding. And so I was in a really fun setting with people that I'd known since I was about 4 years old. And it was great. But what happened is after being there for a long time, I slowly but surely started getting these opportunities to work directly with like the retail clients.
Yep.
Advisors would come in and say, you know what, would you mind just coming and talking to clients on my behalf, because you're so much more comfortable with this topic, right? And after I did that, a number of times, what I found was that the relationship with the individuals you were actually serving and doing this work for was very different. One meeting in particular, this woman, she cried because we had put this plan together, and it was an emotional moment. Her husband had passed away. She didn't know if she was going to have to go back to work, right? And so we build this whole plan for her, and she cries, and it's with gratitude. It's like these tears of like relief.
Yeah.
And I remember in that moment, it was one of those periods in time where everything kind of like changed, right? I had a lot of friendships, right? I developed friendships and people I'd worked with that were happy with what we were doing and grateful for the help, but it was not the same kind of thing, right? It was like, it was just a very, very different type of a relationship that you would have. And I remember at that moment, it was one of those like, wow, I'm here, I work with my best friends, but I've lost my drive. I've lost my passion. I can't do this anymore. And the story goes a little bit longer, but eventually what happened was this probably sounds like a bit of a repeat for you. You're probably having deja vu, because I called Chris and I explained this all to him and asked if Apriem was hiring.
Sure.
One of the things I will say is that of the hundreds of different firms that I had worked with over my almost decade-long career, Apriem was the only company that I wanted to work for, and you guys were the only ones that I actually approached about beginning, changing careers and shifting over. And I can remember, well, I know that the reason that was because of how you guys treat your clients. I guess I can say how we treat our clients now.
You're part of that.
Yeah, but at the time, I was on the outside and I'm looking in, and I'm going, if I'm going to sit on that side of the table, and I want to enter into this RIA space, right, where it's all about best interest and being a fiduciary and doing what's right for the client. I was in this position where I got to see the truth behind everyone, right? All these people I was working with. And I will tell you, in my whole career, I never met anyone that said that they don't do what's in the best interest of their clients. Everybody says they do what's in the best interest of their clients.
Sure. But
when I'm there and I'm receiving the work on the other end, and I said, hey, this is in the best interest of your client, but then I get this back.
Yeah.
That's
didn't have the control.
Yeah. It doesn't matter what was verbally said. Like, this was the actual actions.
Sure.
And so I don't want to harp on the industry, but I do want to say that, Apriem was one of those firms that you guys never asked. You didn't ask about how much you got paid. Sure. There was never a question. And what I received back was what I had recommended to begin with.
Yeah. Well, you're also describing just in general, the difference between commission-based advising and being fiduciary, et cetera. Which I think a lot of our clients obviously come to us because we're fiduciary, right?
Absolutely.
And then the topic of retirement income, you're also kind of describing the fact that you were sometimes pigeonholed into, this is the solution that I think is best, but now this person's doing this because it makes them more money, et cetera. Whereas today we get to talk about everything from real estate income to stocks to dividends, bond yield, private equity interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right?
Yeah. So you get in a situation where it's no longer, it's just about what's right.
Sure.
And there's no conflicts of interest that exist there. And that makes it much easier to make recommendations that are really based on individuals. In fact, it kind of makes me think of this story.
Sure.
This happened really over this last weekend. So my son, one of his friends, they actually live downstairs from us, right? We're in a fourplex over in Newport Beach on Balboa Peninsula. And his buddy is having a birthday party. I've been fortunate enough that his dad, that set everything up, has also referred his sister to us.
Okay.
And I'm just now getting to work with his sister. And so when we're out there, she arrives, and I give her a hug and we start chatting. And she's in a little bit of a tough situation. So her longtime boyfriend and life partner has recently passed away. And he has left his entire estate to her. Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. And so I'm helping to guide her, essentially through this process of settling his estate. And there's some really interesting things that we can talk about on how this kind of case study itself actually plays out. But when we were there on the beach, she said something that I think is really, it's really relevant for our conversation today, right? She says, Josh, okay, so I know that we're going to be moving these assets over, and you guys are going to manage those assets. Mm-hmm. And my boyfriend, will leave his name out for privacy purposes, but he was very, very active. He was always watching, financial news. He had it on TV all the time. In fact, it was so much that I would give him a hard time and make fun of him. But I know that he was really paying a lot of attention, and he picked a lot of these stocks out that I think are probably actually pretty good and we should hang on to. Very growth oriented, and some higher risk type positions, which obviously, right, a lot of growth, typically a lot more risk.
Sure.
And she goes, so I think we should probably hang on to those. How do you guys handle that? In our role, you've come across this, many times before, right? I mean, you want to be sensitive to this person's wishes.
Absolutely.
It's their money, it's their assets, they're inheriting it. I get that there's some emotional tie to it as well, right? He had bought these, right? He clearly believed in them.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, they're coming to us as the professional and asking, for advice. They're paying for advice. And so I ended up telling her, I think it's really important that you understand that when he was here and he was still working, right, he's contributing, his long-term goals and his long-term plan is very different than what your goals right now and your plan right now is, right? Because we're switching everything that's been happening from an accumulation where we're putting money in to a income distribution. Like, we need to start taking income off of it. She needs income off of it, right? We have to live off of it. And she inherited the home has property taxes, right? And his income's not here anymore, right? And so the way that we have to invest now for retirement and for income distribution has to be different, because your goals, your needs are very different.
So just for the audience too, why do you say that? What is the concept that's making you say this person needs to sell the high flying stocks? Change the plan a little bit.
Yeah, so there's an industry terminology for it. So if everyone wanted to look it up and really read into it, it's what's called sequence of returns risk. And typically, if we're going to be taking withdrawals on a portfolio, sequence of returns risk can be the biggest risk factor that will eat into the longevity, how long those assets themselves can actually last.
So I have this highly volatile position that maybe has a long-term average of something great. I'm just making this up. It's a great stock. It's averaged 12% over the course of 10 years, right? Whatever.
Right. Fantastic.
Right? But so
I could take 12% every year, right, as my income, and it won't go anywhere, right?
But unfortunately, because of sequence of returns, something with that kind of a profile is typically down 70, up 90, down 30, up 20. Like, it's a very volatile path to average that 12%.
Correct.
And so if you need a steady stream of income off of an asset, and that asset is down, way down from a year you need it, and you're selling proportionately way more shares at that time, then that bounce back, even though you would have averaged that with the remaining shares, your dollar amount gets less and less and less.
Exactly. In fact, I've talked about this a lot. I oftentimes think about it's almost like the reverse of compounding.
Sure.
Right. So, I have $100 and I earn 10%. I have $110 and then I earn 10% again. Well, now I'm earning 10% on $110, right? So all of my interest keeps adding to the amount that I can return, right? But when it comes to sequence of returns risk, it's essentially the exact opposite, right? If I had $100 and I'm going to use 50% because it's easier math, right? And I lose 50%,
or 50,
I now have $50.
Right.
And so the next year, right, and not even taking a withdrawal, right? This is just straight returns. I drop 50%. The next year, the market returns 50% positive. How much is my account balance?
You're only back to what, 75?
$75.
You need 100% to get back to full.
I would need 100% return the next year in order to get back, right? Because I don't have $100, I have $50, right? And so 50%, that's only $25.
And that's, like you said, without taking anything. So you sell shares, your 50 now is 25 because you had to sell shares. That 25, now the 50% return or 100% return only gets you back half, right? It's a vicious cycle, to your point.
It's a vicious cycle, and it can eat away at a portfolio that was supposed to last 30 years, and now all of a sudden the portfolio lasts 15. I'm making these numbers up, right? But typically when we're talking retirement income planning, that's probably the biggest risk that we have to make sure that we're being careful of and avoiding. And so in this particular situation, Right. Well, if we have highly volatile
Everything changed.
assets, regardless of if it's got a lot of upside,
Yeah.
that upside comes with tons of ups and downs along the way. And if you're
Right.
selling every month to generate monthly income,
Right.
you're getting hit with things like sequence of returns risk.
So I'm sure we'll get into this, but my mind goes to, well, you could keep some of the growth, but then now you need some balancing act to balance out some of that sequence of returns. But let's take it clean slate for a second.
Sure.
So let's go back several steps and just start. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, when you, like, if you think of your own retirement plan, or just in general, a retirement plan, starting from scratch, what's the first step someone should think about?
Yeah, well, I would think, first off, I think that with the story we talked about, I think it really highlights the fact that everyone's different, right? Everyone's needs are different, right? So it's not always exactly the same path, but there are, I think, some big picture principles that we can make sure that we're following to keep us on track. And in my opinion, and I know you share the same opinion, but there's an initial first step where everyone hands down should be starting. I think everyone needs a plan. Okay, and so if you haven't had an appointment or you haven't had a financial plan,
shameless plug,
shameless PSA here, yeah, exactly. All right, so there's the plug.
Plan.
Get a financial plan.
Yeah.
If you haven't had it updated in a while, have it updated.
Sure.
Come back to it regularly, regardless of how simple. Like you can have a very simple plan, but if you don't have a plan, that can be a problem. That all of a sudden one day you realize, like, oh no, I'm in this situation that I could have caught ahead of time very easily.
Right.
Okay.
Well, yeah. All jokes aside, I mean, variables change all the time.
Yeah.
No plan is set in stone. No, not a good one in my opinion.
Right.
It needs to constantly be evolving.
It's living.
It's a living, breathing thing. It needs to fluctuate along with the vicissitudes of life, right? It needs to go up and down with it and change and mold, and laws change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So now that I've got my shameless plug in about the importance of a plan, right? I think Benjamin Franklin said, failing to plan is planning to fail, or something to that effect, right?
Sounds good.
So now I got my shameless plug out of the way. Step one, make sure we have a plan. Sure. But after that, I mean, really in the planning process, I think that at its core, you can't talk about income planning without talking about expenses. I mean, budgeting, yes, it's that, it's one of those words, and it kind of makes some of us cringe. Sure. Surprisingly, I've actually found a lot of people that actually really enjoy the conversation of budgeting. The very analytical one in the family is like, oh, I've got the budget planned out perfect.
Spreadsheets,
But you got to know what your expenses are, and then you can even dig into your expenses even further.
Sure.
When it comes to your expenses, especially back when I was dealing on the annuity side of the business, there was always this idea of what's your essential expenses or required spending. You can name it whatever you want, as compared to your discretion or your fund money, whatever you want to name that, right? So there's two pieces to expenses.
Just to be clear, so you have necessary side, you're talking health insurance, your very important insurance premiums, basic food, basic shelter,
like my 4 walls and my
necessities.
Yeah.
And then you have discretionary, or the fun stuff, which is anywhere from travel to streaming services, all the stuff that you don't actually need, but you want.
Everything you don't need, but you want.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And I personally, just a quick thing. I even like to do discretionary. I don't know how you like to, your favorite, but into several categories alone, just to scratch. I have my true necessary.
Right.
And then I've got, kind of like I really, really want this, something like a gym membership or a Netflix subscription.
Like if I could, it would be in my.
Right. It's almost necessary.
It's almost necessary.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And then there's like another category that's close to that, right?
Yeah.
For some people that maybe that is the gym membership or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And then you have like the really nice to have, or maybe even a better example would be lesser travel, right? Simple travel.
Sure. Yeah.
But then I have my dream level of travel.
Extravagant travel.
That is this, right? So if you tier that out and have different buckets for that,
right,
that's step one.
I think that is step one. You should know your spending. You should know your expenses and where they fall. And I would know the two different categories.
And the rationale for this, again, coming full circle, we're starting with this concept of sequence of returns. So if we're solving different kinds of income sources for those different levels, that's why we're doing this and being granular about it.
I would say yes. It all falls back on sequence of returns. So let's just pretend, as an example, we didn't have any income planning tools, right? We just have highly volatile assets.
Sure.
Okay. When the market's down and income is tight, what's the first thing to go? What do we cut back on first?
That for the one I used, the top level, but dream vacation now turns into lesser, or depending on the severity of the crash.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And so even if I still have to sell some assets at lower prices, which I don't want to do, right? I don't want to sell my, my assets to the young guy that's accumulating, that's willing to buy it at a discount because I need the money to fund my expenses. But even if I'm forced into this position where I have to sell something, at least I know, okay, I can let go of all these top tiers of discretionary spending, and here's my essential spending. Maybe I have a few months that I have to do this and things are tight, but then I can immediately make the change. I can switch much quicker.
Flexible budgeting, flexible planning, etc. Again, not ideal, not what you want. You ideally have your entire thing planned out to where you never have to cut back.
Right.
But you're saying in that event, right?
Yeah.
So,
in that event. So that's really important. I think that the next reason why having your expenses really dialed in is really important is because after we have that, then the next thing we look at isn't all the investments, it's what income do you already have.
Sure.
Right. And so there's certain sources of income, like Social Security is kind of a natural. Of course, not everybody gets Social Security.
No, people assume, but a lot of our clients don't.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very, very surprising how many folks actually aren't going to receive Social Security. Think about all those teachers that right? They don't actually get Social Security, right? They have a pension, right? And they get pension income, but they don't get the Social Security income.
Sure.
And then oftentimes you've got, maybe a husband and wife, and one of them is going to get Social Security, the other is going to get a pension.
Right.
There's all sorts of different types of income streams that can happen when you're doing the planning process. But we want to know what sources of income are available. What am I going to get from Social Security? That's also going to help us really determine one of those big questions, like when should I start taking Social Security?
Sure.
Right.
That's a whole deep rabbit hole there.
It's a very deep rabbit hole. I would say there's lots of folks that just default to saying like, well, you always just want to take the maximum. I think that anytime you have a hard and fast, this is the only way of doing it, and that's a red flag in my mind. The answer is it
depends.
It depends. Right. And so
it really does.
It does. I think it really depends on everyone's situations. People are different, and we can talk in more detail on Social Security, but I want to keep on this other process we're talking about here. So I've got Social Security. I've got a pension. Maybe we have some rental property that we collect income off of on a regular basis. Maybe I have inherited money, and that's pays me, a specific income designated by the trust, right? The trust is saying, this is how much I'm going to get. There's all sorts of different ways. Maybe I have an annuity, right? My annuity is paying me income, right? So again, everyone's different, but we need to know what's that number.
So you find your baseline passive, predominantly passive, mostly passive type of income that's coming in, and then you're almost describing like filling up a bucket of water with different lines at it, right? It's like you have your first line at your necessary spending, and then you got your different levels of discretionary, however you want to define that. And then you're pouring water in there with, okay, so here's the income first for all my guaranteed stuff, right? Here's my pension from work, here's my CalSTRS, and here's my Social Security. And I'm making this up, it totals $4,000.
Sure.
Okay. And my necessary spending that I just gave you in my budget is $4,500.
Great. So we're actually really close in that kind of a situation to being able to cover at least our necessary or essential expenses.
But just to be clear, Josh, in my hypothetical example, I want to spend 12.
Want to spend 12. But what this gives us is we're shooting for 12.
Sure.
But I need to make sure that I at least get my shortfall that's there to my bare minimum. And so I like to think about it, like you said, in those kind of different layers or those types of buckets first, because when I was working on the annuity side of the business, right, where essentially we're looking to generate income, one of the biggest, I don't know if I would necessarily call it a mistake, but I would definitely say it's a bit of I don't know if it's an oversight, but essentially what it is that a lot of the time we get in these situations where we have a client and the client is retiring, right? And they have, outside of their home, their next biggest asset is their retirement account, right? 401k or 403b or whatever it may be. And some of these guys come and their goal is to roll 100% of that retirement money into an annuity, right? But we're looking to produce income, right? It's for retirement. It's going to be retirement money. It's going to produce income. It's going to last for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
One of the biggest drawbacks of annuities in general, one of the biggest complaints is they're very illiquid.
Sure.
Essentially when we put our money in
Restrictive,
there,
yeah.
it's very restrictive. It's
Yeah.
tough to get it out without big fees or penalties. Sometimes they can be very expensive in general if
Sure.
you have something like a variable annuity. And they'll oftentimes have liquidity provisions. I can get 10% of my, my funds out in a year. But what if we need more than that?
Sure.
Or what if life changes? What if there's so many what ifs that could occur.
Sure.
And so getting back to the income side of things, oftentimes if we know that number, right, and I'm working on something like, it could be anything. We're just talking an annuity right now for this conversation. Okay. It might not take all of the money to generate the extra $500 per month to get my essential expenses covered, right? Small percentage. Yeah. I've got some, now I can layer that on top of my Social Security, my pensions, my necessary expenses are now locked in,
sure.
For life. And then the rest of the discretionary, well, now we can cover this discretionary spending through withdrawals off the rest of the assets that are left over by not taking everything and shoving it into something that's very illiquid and restrictive.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. And so when I think about it, that's kind of the big picture, at least the initial layers of planning that I look at.
Yeah. So solving for that necessary.
Solve for the necessary.
Here, right?
Yep.
Just to be clear.
First, we solve for the necessary.
Yep.
Second, we solve for discretionary.
Sure.
Right. Here's now that we've got what we need, how do we get what we like? So there's a bit of a conversation to be had in there about accounting for inflation over time.
Of course.
Right. And how, coming off of last year, even right now, inflation is a big topic and it's obviously something that you want to be aware of and account for as time goes on. So that's also included in there, right? Because even our essential expenses are likely going to be going up and inflating over time.
Of course, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So
maybe something flexible to keep up with that.
Yeah, so that should be an important piece of the conversation. Okay. Yeah. Now those are foundational, right? And so I think that after we get those pieces in, then we can kind of let's talk about the more big picture fun stuff, like covering the rest of the discretionary spending or fun spending that's there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's go. So maybe just a quick, so now we've kind of talked a little bit about this the necessary. Now we're doing discretionary.
Sure.
There's maybe bigger number in this example, right?
Yeah.
So common ways that we see people solve their retirement income needs, right? So I'm just going to throw some things out here. Maybe we can go through pros and cons of all these, right? So
sure.
There's stocks, two kinds, right? You have appreciation growth and you have dividends.
Yeah.
Right. That's a pretty popular one.
Sure.
Then you have bond yield. To a lesser extent, there can be some appreciation, but typically you're using it for income.
Yeah.
And
especially
also,
now,
exactly,
right? I think 2 years ago,
sure.
It wasn't necessarily the same conversation as it is today.
Sure. And it's also, there's a dry powder concept in there maybe we talk about, right? Of course, in higher interest rate environments like we're in right now, you have cash and cash equivalents that pay interest in general, right?
Yeah.
You have rental income, both residential and commercial.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people have private equity interest in a business, either one that they started that they're passing off and or that they buy into, right? So they're typically like an LP, right? As opposed to other things, right? Those are probably the most common. Anything you want to, and then of course there's like annuities, you mentioned that, et cetera, right? We see that.
Yeah.
And then we've already talked about that though. So
Yeah. I mean, it can be used for the discretionary side, but typically, look, this is coming from a background where I did that for a decade. Yeah. I don't necessarily see, I don't necessarily see that as being needed to cover your discretionary expenses, right? I think that if you can get your essential expenses locked in and covered, that's a good place for it.
Great.
There's some other topics we could always get into, things like, we're going to pass assets on, and I'm concerned about them being a spendthrift or something like that, sure. Right? Where this can come into play in that case. But I think when we start talking this discretionary stuff, I think that there's more flexibility that's there, right? And so we don't necessarily need as much, structure.
Sure. So, okay. So as we've kind of laid out all these, just maybe let's take one step back for a second. Just kind of realized maybe we could talk about withdrawal rates and safe withdrawal rates, that concept.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of debate around this rule called the 4% rule.
Okay. Can you define the 4% rule for everybody?
Yes. So there was a gentleman by the name of William Bingen, who developed this this idea or this concept where he went through and he essentially back tested a balanced portfolio of 60% stocks and 40% bonds at different withdrawal rates, from 2% to 8% withdrawals, to see which ones could essentially last for, he used a 30-year period of time as the definition of success.
Okay, so just a quick pause. $1 million portfolio in this test, 60% equities or stocks, 40% bonds. So 600,000 in stocks, 400,000 in bonds, cash equivalents, things like that, right? And then you're drawing anywhere from out of that million 2 to 8%, which would be $20,000 to $80,000 per year.
Yep, and then he was adjusting it. All these scenarios each year would be adjusted to account for inflation as well. So starting at that percentage and then slowly but surely increasing.
Got it.
Right. And then obviously, lower withdrawal rates last indefinitely.
Sure. Right.
And higher withdrawal rates deplete down faster.
Taking less than 1%.
Exactly.
Dividends and basic interest would cover you, and then some.
It's just continuing to grow, right?
Sure.
And then back tests go all the way. I believe he went back to 1926, as I recall. It's been a while since I looked at those numbers, so don't quote me on that. But I think it was 1926, and he did these rolling 30-year periods of time with that type of asset allocation and those types of withdrawal rates. And essentially, through all of his analytics that he did on this, or the analysis, he found that a 4% withdrawal rate increased each year, to account for inflation, would last for 30 years of income. And he found that this happened 100% of the time. Now, there's still some debate around this because obviously at the time he was doing the study, interest rates were very, very different than they've been in the past decade, right? Sure. We've been in a very, very low interest rate environment for, I think since about 2007, since we'd seen rates that are about where they're at right now, right? So it's been a long time. And so the interest rate environment's been very, very different. Equity environment's been different. So
you're saying some people would argue because of current macroeconomics and market dynamics, either for higher or lower, depending on the situation, but somewhere around that number.
Yeah, I would say so. If you went back, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there's a lot of conversation around things like, is the 60-40 portfolio dead? Is the 4% rule does it still hold true? We've done, I think Morningstar was one of the companies that had done a study, and they found that the new safe withdrawal rate was something like 2.8%. But this changes, right? All of a sudden now we're sitting today, and what you can get on money, even just safe money, sitting in cash, 4.5%, 4.85% for just having safe money sitting on the sidelines that didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago, right?
I think I even saw something recently where the father of this rule, the person that invented it, said you could actually go higher now, right? Because of interest rates.
Because it's come back around, right? Interest rates have come back around. And so when we talk about this 4% rule, that's the essence of the 4% rule. But there's definitely still some debate on whether or not that is the way to go. But if all things being equal, essentially the rule says you could take 4%, a 4% withdrawal off of your portfolio, and theoretically this should last for 30 years of income.
And just to say this out loud, one of my least favorite things about these broad rules is that we know all the exceptions and we can tear it apart, right?
Yes.
And so like an obvious one that's rolling around in my head right now is a 4% rule appropriate for an early retired person that started at 45? Or is it the 4% rule appropriate for someone who's 82 that just retired, or in their early 70s, right? Like these are all very different questions,
right?
To your earlier point where it depends, right?
Yes, it does.
And so withdrawal rates can be higher or lower. And there's been many times where I've argued for both higher and lower than the 4% rule because of that person's situation.
Sure.
Yeah. And there's also flexible budgeting concept, all that stuff that we talked about.
Well, and I think that then circles us all the way back to the beginning where, I kind of mentioned it's important to have a financial plan because everyone's different. Every situation is different, right? And so I think leaning on, like you said, these very broad rules, they work when you're just trying to talk to general masses, right? Oh, we're talking to, a very, very wide net, and this is going to work for most people.
Sure.
Right. But when it comes down to it, everyone's different, and it doesn't necessarily hold true in that case.
Sure.
So anyway, What were we talking about that got us on the 4% rule? I remember we were
The
starting to get into some of the fun stuff, but then
concept of withdrawing and discretionary budget, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
again, in my crude example earlier, right,
Yeah.
we were about 8 grand shy on a
Right.
monthly basis.
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
rounding.
Yeah.
And then so just rough math, right? So using a 4% rule, that's what, 96,000 a year, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so now we're approaching where you need a pretty solid number to get there, right? Roughly 2-3 million, give or take, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Depends how you want to,
Yeah,
how you want to approach
size
it with
it.
that
Yeah,
4%
how
rule, or
approach it.
2% or 5%, et cetera, right?
And so, okay, so then this is going to get into another concept, which we didn't really talk about, although it was loosely covered, right? So we talk about that 4% lasting for 30 years, right? That's because you are drawing principal down over time.
Sure.
I've talked to a lot of folks where that is a no. I do not want my principal value to go down, or I want to keep it as close as possible. I'm happy to live off of dividends and interest and
Sure.
whatever that number ends up being.
Yeah.
Right. Which is more of a like a capital appreciation style of collecting income,
Yeah.
right? Because I want to make sure I leave all of this behind.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to withdraw anything down over time.
Sure.
Right. And
maybe they
so,
have an inheritance goal for the next generation, or
Right.
they don't, right?
Yeah.
Everything in
where,
between.
right, and then you and I both know, like, you have the reverse of that, where they say,
Yeah.
you know what,
My
a
last
perfect,
check to bounce.
I want my last check to bounce,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
that's a perfect retirement plan for me. Is I spent everything and then I died,
Right.
right? And so I think that as we're thinking about these kinds of things too, like what is it for you? Like where
Yeah.
do you fall in those needs and wants? And sometimes our needs force us, you know, to have to pick something else. And sometimes we go, hey, I'm doing very, very well. I can spend
Sure.
a heck of a lot more and be fine. I'm going to take those, you know, those extraordinary trips every year because I can, because Chris told me I need to spend more money.
Those are the fun conversations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about the 4% withdrawal rule. We've really covered, I think, the essence of essential spending and discretionary spending.
Yep.
Let me just see here. It looks like. Okay, I thought we had a question. We don't have a question. I was going to say we could address a question. But on that note, if you guys have questions on anything
Yeah.
that we're talking about, or you want us to dive
We've done
deeper on any of
40
these,
minutes, right?
we're just going to riff and chat and talk. So, but if there's things you want us to cover, we're obviously happy to do it. Just send those in the questions. There's like a little Q&A box that's down there. You can click that and you can submit any kind of thoughts or questions that you have or areas you want us to cover. Okay.
Yeah. So one thing I heard you kind of hinting at was that you mentioned this thing, total return, right?
Sure.
We've talked about solving retirement income with stocks, with bond, real estate, et cetera, all these different kinds of passive income sources. So that seems to be a common theme, right?
Right.
So what advice would you have for someone who's just kind of asking you, hey, I'm open to all of them, like what are some pros and cons? What would you do, right? Like how would you solve for your own retirement?
Well, I think let's talk about total return first.
Sure.
Okay. And I think before we can really get into total return, I think we have to really define dividends. And I think I was looking at the names, of everyone who's in attendance. I think most of the folks here are pretty comfortable with what dividends are. But this very intelligent financial advisor that I know is a CFP and an AIF and happens to work here a long time ago explained dividends to me as being similar to rental income from a piece of property. Mm. If you guys didn't catch that, it's this guy here. But that was just one of those moments that, like, I had heard and I knew the textbook definition. I knew what dividends were. But when you explained it that way and you said that, I like to talk to clients and tell them that dividends are like rental income from a piece of rental property. I was like, that is probably one of the best descriptions of how to at least think about it. Yeah.
This $50-ish thing.
Yeah.
That pays you $1 or $2 a year.
Sure.
So it's like a little mini property.
Yep.
That pays. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And the property, that share, just like a rental property, can appreciate in value and it can also lose value.
Yeah.
Right. But I got a great renter that's in there, and theoretically they've got a really good credit score, right? And they always pay their rent and they pay it on time, right? And I really like them, right? And so that's that rental income that's paying off of there. That's my dividend income. And now if I go and I sell that piece of property and that piece of property has appreciated in value since I bought it, well, I have both the return of the appreciation on the property, plus I have that rental income, that dividend income that's been paying me. When I add those two together, that is what total return is.
Sure.
So when we're having these conversations, we're talking about total return. That's what we're talking about. So just so everyone's aware, I think it's one of those concepts that can be easy to miss.
Yeah.
It's also, this is also like unrealized versus realized gains, right? We don't realize the gain until we sell the asset.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had a question come in for you.
Oh, great. We got.
How much is the current government withdrawal amount from retirement accounts? Wondering how that compares to the 4% withdrawal.
So my guess is we're talking about required minimum distributions.
Yeah, I would say RMDs, and maybe we could talk about that path, and then also you could almost interpret a little bit like treasury rates too.
Okay.
And interest rates.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, let's tackle it from. I'm assuming it's required minimum distributions.
Sure.
Let's tackle from that approach first. Okay. And so, just to keep everybody on board, an RMD or a required minimum distribution is applied to retirement accounts where we put money in, we essentially get a deduction on our income that year, and then we get tax deferred growth on those dollars.
So pre-tax 401k, pre-tax IRA.
Exactly. So we've never paid any taxes on any of the money that's inside of these accounts, nor have we paid taxes on any of the growth that's inside of these accounts. And so before I get to the RMD piece, any withdrawals that come out of there are going to receive ordinary income tax treatment. So we're not getting capital gains treatment on those dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. These are really important when we're doing retirement planning, right? Because we're trying to minimize tax impact and bite. So what happens is the government says, hey, you've had these dollars in there that you never paid any taxes on, and we've let you accumulate and grow them tax-free for all this time, and you're starting to get older. Well, we want you to start paying some taxes on those dollars. And that comes in the form of a required minimum distribution. Okay. And then over the past couple of years, there's been a number of different acts that have been passed that have kind of furthered some of the confusion about how much RMD withdrawals are, when they should start. So before all of this came, the starting age for required minimum distributions was actually 70 and a half years old. Mm-hmm. And you would take it in the year following the year in which you turned 70 and a half. And then each year after that, you would have to take a withdrawal. And as you age, those withdrawal rates would actually get higher. Now, here's the difference is that this is based off of life expectancy tables, not a percentage. So there's a factor that you're going to get, which is essentially your life expectancy factor. And the way that these tables work is they have you take that factor, you divide it by your December 31st value, and it tells you what the dollar amount of withdrawal should be. They don't actually think about it as like a percentage withdrawal. I could see that over time, it's probably relatively close. But when you get in later years, I think it's gonna far exceed the withdrawals you would take from a 4% withdrawal rule.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. And we've seen that now.
Yeah, once we start getting in our 80s, it really starts to accelerate the withdrawal rate to try to get you to spend it all before you die.
So I think it's a great question because basically it starts a little bit under and then starts tiering over and over, and they really force you towards the end of it to take a lot more than that 4%. Yeah, if you have it left. Yeah. So if any of you guys have done any of the planning and you see the projections on the graph, it's very, very common for those projections to go up, in most of the years of your retirement. And then when we start getting into those late 70s, early 80s, that hump starts to come, and then it starts to slant and come back down towards the later years of retirement. And that's pretty much almost always due to the fact that these required minimum distributions get really high. Yeah. Just because that's a great question that came in, and I think it's relevant to the conversation. You want to talk a little bit about like Roth conversions and how that could be kind of a great solution to that? Sure. Yeah. So okay, I'm gonna toss that to you. I'm gonna let you talk. Yeah, it's definitely a common theme, right? So while we're on this topic, right? So you have your earning years, right? I'm just gonna take a very stereotypical situation. Someone retires in their mid to late 60s, retire, and then to your point, RMDs have been pushed back. So there's this time period where there's a gap, right? Where you don't have as much earned income coming in because you're retired. you don't have to take from your portfolio.
Right.
And so, you'd see in a tax simulation, taxes are high when you're earning, come down to
Also, retirement
Right.
comes, and also your
and
taxes
then
drop way low.
shoots back up for RMDs, right? So there's
Yeah.
this little hill there, right?
Yeah.
And so around retirement income planning, what you can do is, as you're solving for someone's main goals, you can kind of fill in the gap. I almost picture it like smoothing pavement, where you can do a conversion and kind of smooth out that efficient tax rate over a long period of time to fill in that gap, which I think is what you're alluding to.
And so I have a few clients that are actively utilizing these Roth conversions. And so what we do is we will typically get together around November, October, November of each year. And the reason we do that is because we've had the entire year now to receive income from all the different sources we receive income from. And if we took withdrawals off of any of our accounts, we can account for what does our tax picture look like this year. And then we can determine or zero in on how much would be an appropriate amount to convert without maybe bumping ourselves in too high of a tax bracket, so that over the long term, it still makes sense and ends up being a good decision.
Okay, I have a totally different question for you. So it's around retirement income though. So we come across a situation, a decent amount, where someone is preparing to retire and or very recently retired.
Okay.
What would be your best 1, 2, 3, or whatever your advice is for how to handle that emotionally?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that's hard, I think, for people to
it's a big emotional jump to go from, I don't know how everybody's paid differently, right? But we get paid on the 1st and the 15th of every month.
Sure.
Right. And to go from having this steady paycheck of income coming in on the 1st and 15th of each month to now I'm no longer getting money that's coming in. I'm going to start taking withdrawals out of what I've been saving. Right. And so so number one, I'm not sure this is different for everyone, but dependent upon your age, is Social Security something that we're going to be, turning on, right? And so it's important to know that if you are going to turn Social Security on, you want to let them know you can let them know as early as 4 months in advance, right? So might as well get that paperwork in, get it going, so you know that income is going to turn on. I say this because that's going to dictate how much withdrawals we need to take, right, from the rest of our portfolio. Or if it's your pension, right? There's a pension package. You got to fill out that pension packet, that information, and have a date that's going to come. And so there's a couple of key things that I think is really important outside of those two pieces. So one, well, of course, you got to do your plan. You want to have both of those. Send your requests in if that's relevant to your situation, and then you can work with your advisor. So in this case, most of our clients will have a conversation about how do you want to be paid moving forward, right? Because it does feel different. Are you the type of person that says, just give me a quarter's worth of income? This is how much I'm going to spend each month, but I'm very responsible with my spending. Send me 3 months worth of expenses up front on the first day of each quarter, and I'll take quarterly income. Or for us, especially my wife, right, or my husband, my spouse, they're really used to this every 2 weeks. Let's go. I'd like to receive the income on a rolling 2-week basis. All of my bills come in on the 1st. Just give me my entire months on the 1st once every month, right? And so I think picking a date ahead of time when that income is going to come in and have it go to your bank account, just like you had when you were still working. Right. It makes for a really easy transition. It also helps for if we have any like auto bills that are on like auto pay, for there not to be any big hiccup.
Sure.
But you want to plan for that ahead. Maybe a month ahead of time, you work with your advisor, right? Get that set up so that way it can be ready to go on that first day.
So psychologically, what I've heard so far is to help with this transition, find your floor. That's the first part you said. And then the second part was you can make it as normal as you can. So the example you gave, you're used to being paid on the 1st and the 15th. You can have your distributions happen on the 1st and 15th. So it's a little bit more normal for you.
It feels normal. I think that it safeguards us too when we first get to retirement from looking at that account, right, and going, oh, I've got I have $1 million, I have $2 million, I have X amount of dollars. And, and then if I'm taking withdrawals directly out of there, the feel and the perception, it's much easier for me to withdraw more than I should.
Sure.
And to get away from whatever my plan was.
Right.
But if you've set up a retirement
Make it
plan,
automatic.
we know what that expense is,
Yep.
then why change anything we're doing? Now that's one. The other thing, this is actually a really common mistake that I see happen often. Okay. I think that it's important to have an emergency fund on the side, even when you're in retirement, especially right now, because we can actually earn some legitimate interest on our cash.
Sure. Okay,
but we're not earning money anymore, right? And so when that paycheck comes in, I don't need to take from that paycheck that comes in, or that withdrawal from my account. I don't need to pull from that and put it aside in savings like I've been doing previously, because all I'm really doing is moving it from one pocket of savings that's possibly earning more into another pocket of savings that's earning less, right? It's not coming from a paycheck anymore. It's coming out of that account.
So what I'm hearing is have as many dollars as possible working for you.
Have as many dollars as possible working for you. And you would be surprised at how often we go through, we have a review, we look at, hey, here's what your expenses are. And here's what your income is. And we get the green light. Yes, that's how much I spend. Yes, that's how much other income I have coming in. That's all correct. And then we go, well, here's how much we're sending you, when we send money out of the account. And it's more than what the financial plan is saying. So where's those extra dollars going if you're not spending them? Oh, well, it's because I save $500 out of every single one. I put it in my savings account at the bank because that's what I've always done. We don't need to do that anymore.
Sure.
Keep an adequate amount in your emergency fund, but if you need those dollars for emergencies, it's already there. It's in your portfolio, right? Exactly. And so why don't you continue to allow those dollars to work really the way that you had, initially intended.
So rely on that plan, think long-term, big picture, etc.
Yeah.
You've seen helpful for people. The overall concept of financial independence, we talked briefly about it, but just that concept, of moving to living off of your assets. Obviously it's a big thing. It's a big thing emotionally. We see people go through it all the time. But the biggest answer that I see that works well for people is having that concrete plan, having that, seeing it visually, looking at Monte Carlo simulations and the ebb and flow of it. It's helpful to see it visually.
Well, let me ask you this, because I know I've experienced this multiple times, so I'm sure that you have as well. But how often do you have that, whether it's an initial meeting or even like an update or a review, where the nervousness and the weight and the pressure, you can see it on that individual when they first come in, and they're scared to have that conversation about the plan. But then when it's all said and done and they go home, they're elated and the weight's lifted and they feel good because we have a plan and we know what's going to happen, right? And we know that there's a path forward, move through this. So
absolutely.
Anyway, this has been fun.
Yeah,
it's been really fun.
Yeah,
so
please give us feedback and
So survey at the end, right? So everybody's on the call. Please leave your feedback. Let us know what you think. We should probably let everybody know that this is going to be our last live webinar that we do. Because what we found is that over time, we might come back to it. I think from time to time we might do some streaming, but what we found is that, sometimes there can be technical difficulties, sound, audio quality, visual. The slides themselves are fuzzy. They're hard to see. And so what we're going to do moving forward is we're going to start to pre-record these events. They will still come out every month. They will still be released the last Wednesday of each month, so everyone will have access to it. We'll email you to let you know it's been posted to the website. You can watch it there at your leisure. So if you don't have an hour, but you got 15 minutes and you want to watch 15 minutes and come back and watch the rest later, you'll be able to do that. But again, send us your thoughts, your opinions, because we're just trying to continue to bring great content out to everybody. We think this might be a better way for us to do it moving forward. We will also, the plan is, we'll see how it plays out, but the plan is that on the website, we'll put like a question submission box. So if you have questions on whatever the conversation was, you can still submit that and get some answers to whatever we were talking about.
Yep. Sounds good.
Well,
all right. I think that's a wrap.
That's a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.